we're going to look into a Hebrew lesson that actually I had with my Hebrew teacher. And yeah, we did a podcast on Babel, drawn from these studies. And it's a fascinating take on the idea of Babel and seeing the parallels with how we are conversing or not conversing about the emergence of something massive in our day called AI. But we realise as we're talking, it totally is applicable to geopolitics today. So we're not going to go too deep into the Tower of Babel, but we do want to outline it a little bit just to give a bit of background, which we found quite fascinating.
You know, this is the very first significant use case that we've had with this new verse in Babel, isn't it?
We're actually using it on the ground to enhance what we're seeing here in the Middle East. This is the gift of interpreting Babel in this way. Yeah.
So yeah, do you want to go into it since you had the lesson?
Yeah, okay. So very briefly, the ancient Hebrew root word translated often as confused or confound is Balal. And the Hebrew root Balal, it's often translated as confused in terms of confusing the speech, is actually more literally can be translated to be to mingle, like to mix. And even to the extent, this is what Rachmiel brings out, to the idea of nourishment or fodder, something that fertilizes. So the idea is that at Babel, humanity, when they get to the land of Shinar, which was like a teenage stage we saw in the language, from the Hebrew word of Shinar, which you can interpret as Shena'ah, which means literally the land which is youth, which is young man, youth. We saw it as kind of like a teenage thing. Anyway, they needed something else added to their communication at that very stuck point they found themselves in. They needed more definition of language to be able to move on. This is what God came down and saw. Man, I wish we could go into it now, but it's really fascinating. So the languages weren't scrambled like you see in traditional Sunday school interpretation. They were mingled, they were mixed with something more, which allowed for more kind of distinction so they could actually hear each other.
So yeah, the Sunday school traditional interpretation is that God punished humanity. Scrabbled their language so they couldn't understand each other, and that's where we get the hypothesis that that's where we got all our different languages from. But this is something much more powerful, much more deeper, more useful, I suppose. Yeah,
and it's saying maybe this was fertilization of language, and maybe at that moment of na'ah, of teenage state, which we know biologically is a massive gear change, they found themselves in increasing complexity as their experience of being human evolved. They're moving on from the Garden of Eden, which we saw as a cradle state, and then we hit this point in history. And yeah, we were paralleling it with the stuck point that we could be finding ourselves in with AI if we don't have our language fertilized, if we don't learn to talk about it with more definition, even new definition, even new ways of thinking, new language of a new paradigm, more complex language to describe what is growing exponentially out of control almost in this day and age with AI.
Yeah, development at teenage stage, as we were saying, is incredibly fast, and maybe we have something of the same thing going on here on the international stage. And isn't it true that we're using words but we're not hearing each other? And it's got the potential of getting dangerous. We're living in a world that needs more definition. It needs a fertilized language, and maybe the greatest danger isn't the bombs, isn't the rhetoric on each side. Maybe it's the inability to be able to understand and talk with each other rather than at each other, rather than you mentioned about the echo chamber thing.
Yeah, I mean, we enter into our echo chambers. That's why I'm actively trying to look at material that I am not aligned with in order for me to prevent echo chambering in my life. But yeah, so how many of us are praying for God to fertilize language? That's part of what I'm talking about here, rather than demonizing, rather than praying against the enemy. whatever that enemy is, whether it's AI, whether it's ideologies, whether it's leftism, whether it's rightism. I've forgotten the word for it.
Well, we've heard lots of words thrown around like fascism, Nazism. I don't know. There was a couple of marches yesterday in London. And it's ironic, the news story brought it out, that we had a march against the Tommy Rommers and stuff, and then we had another march that was against that march. And it's like, this is madness. This is really polarization happening on a massive level. Maybe the answer is that we need more fertilized language to help describe, to help differentiate in these really complex times. Maybe the polarization is because of the lack of fertilized language in this moment.
Yeah, but a lot of time we're using the same global dictionary, but we're reading it with different minds and therefore entirely different definitions. And as we said before, we're arguing at each other. It's like we're unable to express like a more complicated paradigm that we're actually in. So we're going to see how it actually undifferentiated our speech is, and at this crucial moment in history as well. And maybe that explains why we are all so against each other. As we said, the polarization, maybe it's because we need a bit of fertilization to happen. And you're right, maybe, I was just thinking about this, maybe it's going to be supernatural. Maybe it's something we can't do. Maybe it's something that God is going to do. If we take the pattern of Babel, to come down, and maybe that's what Messiah looks like, because he came down, he injected something into the consciousness of the day. I mean, he completely transformed the landscape of the first century. He said, you've heard it said, but I say, that kind of reframing, Maybe that's what his job is going to be again, and maybe in some sort of pattern, that's actually what we are crying out to happen today. Maybe we need to pray for that.